Welcome to today's Explainer. We're about to unpack a story of staggering ambition, deep miscalculation, and the absolute unforgiving reality of the digital frontier. Honestly, it's a cinematic cautionary tale about one of the most dramatic corporate missteps in the history of digital transformation. We're talking about General Electric, GE. For over a century, this was the undisputed titan of global industry. This is the company that literally built the mechanical backbone of modern civilization. They lit up cities, they powered commercial aviation, and they drove industrial manufacturing across the globe. But today, we're exploring their disastrous foray into creating an industrial software empire called Predix. And look, this isn't just a story about a field product. It's an absolute masterclass in the immense and often totally invisible complexities of industrial artificial intelligence. $7 billion. Think about that for a second. That is the staggering scale of the stakes we're dealing with today. This massive fortune was lost in a bold and arguably reckless bid to completely dominate a brand new technological frontier. You know, when we usually talk about corporate blunders, we're analyzing a missed quarterly earnings target or maybe a failed marketing campaign. But here, we are looking at a financial crater the size of a small nation's GDP, just entirely vaporized into the cloud. It was completely swallowed up in the relentless pursuit of an industrial internet revolution that, well, just never materialized the way it was promised. Which naturally brings us to the central mystery of our story. Why is industrial AI so incredibly hard? How could an absolute Goliath like General Electric, a company armed with near bottomless pockets, armies of brilliant engineers, and a whole century of undisputed manufacturing dominance, get it so catastrophically wrong? As we're about to uncover, the answer isn't simply about bad code or bad luck. It's a tragic saga deeply rooted in strategy, culture, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what it actually takes to merge heavy physical machinery with cutting-edge software. Section 1. The Top 10 Ambition. From Turbines to Tech. The sheer hubris of this initiative was truly staggering. GE's leadership at the time made an incredibly bold, almost unbelievable public claim. They stated they were going to transform this heavy industrial giant into a top 10 software company. Let that sink in for a moment. A legacy corporation historically famous for forging literal steel, building massive wind turbines, and assembling complex MRI machines was suddenly claiming it would seamlessly step into the digital ring and stand shoulder to shoulder with Silicon Valley's absolute elite. Companies like Microsoft, Google, and Apple. To tech insiders, this sounded completely absurd. The goal was to launch GE Digital and entirely reinvent the company's DNA overnight, pivoting straight from heavy metal to software code. It was a Goliath-level ambition. Section 2. The Universal Platform Fallacy. Building the Everything OS. To really understand why this grand vision ultimately crumbled, we have to look closely at the fundamental flaw in what GE actually attempted to build with the Predix platform. Because instead of finding one highly specific industrial problem and solving it perfectly, GE attempted the mathematically and logistically impossible. They fell victim to what's known as the platform fallacy. Basically, they tried to build a universal, overarching operating system, an everything OS, for the entire industrial world. Think about the sheer mechanical differences involved here. They wanted a single software blanket that could simultaneously optimize the sprawling, chaotic variables of a national power grid, monitor the intense physical health of a 200-ton freight locomotive, and perfectly manage the complex aerodynamics of a commercial airplane in mid-flight. The core technical misstep really comes down to this. In the world of industrial AI, targeted solutions are infinitely greater than a universal platform. You see, consumer software can afford to be somewhat one-size-fits-all, right? A web browser is a web browser whether you're using it in a coffee shop or a high-rise office. But industrial AI requires extreme, painstaking specialization. A wind turbine requires millions of unique data points directly related to hyperlocal weather patterns, wind physics, and extreme metallurgy. Those data structures, sensor frequencies, and safety tolerances have absolutely nothing in common with the delicate radiation-shielded environment of an MRI machine in a hospital. By trying to build a master platform that did everything for everyone, Predix became far too bloated and unimaginably complex to do anything perfectly for anyone. Section 3. Silicon Valley versus Industrial Giant. A culture clash. And this created a violent collision between two entirely incompatible worlds. On one side, you have GE's traditional engineering culture, When you're building a jet engine that carries hundreds of human beings at 30,000 feet, your entire corporate culture must be incredibly slow, highly methodical, highly risk-averse, and completely obsessed with zero defects. You simply cannot afford a single mistake because a single mistake costs lives. On the other side, you have the Silicon Valley ethos that GE Digital desperately tried to import. Picture the stereotypical tech startup. Fast-paced, software-driven, and governed by that famous mantra to move fast and break things. Pushing out a beta update at 5 p.m. on a Friday. But here's the reality. You cannot push out a buggy beta software update to a spinning jet engine or a fiery blast furnace and just promise to patch it later. The software developers and the veteran aerospace engineers were speaking two completely different languages, which basically doomed the execution from the inside out.
Section 4. The sunk cost pivot. Bleeding billions.
The timeline of this collapse played out like a slow-motion tragedy. First came the massive budget allocation. They were just throwing billions of dollars at a digital dream with immense confidence. But quickly, the reality of the universal platform began to set in, and the software struggled heavily under its own bloated weight and the intense cultural divide of its creators, which inevitably led to the hardest, most agonizing part for any major corporation: the painful, undeniable realization of failure. The sunk costs were truly astronomical, but pushing forward with the original vision was completely unviable. GE finally had to swallow their pride, face their shareholders, and execute a drastic, desperate pivot to a completely new strategy.
The realities of this pivot were incredibly harsh. After those billions of dollars were spent and lost in sunk costs, GE had to completely abandon the dream of the everything OS. And I want you to really feel the weight of that word, abandon. They were forced to dramatically downsize their towering ambitions. With profound humility, they retreated from the grand platform narrative and shifted all their focus to far smaller, targeted, modular solutions. They went from trying to rule the digital world to simply building software that solves specific, highly technical problems for isolated pieces of machinery. It was a massive humbling for a legendary titan, but ultimately, it was the only possible way to salvage any real value from the crumbling initiative.
Section 5. Lessons from the fallout. The limits of budget. So, what's the ultimate lesson of the Predix story? It's this. Digital transformation requires so much more than just a massive budget. The harsh, unforgiving reality is that you cannot simply buy your way into being a software titan, especially if that transformation requires entirely abandoning your company's core DNA. GE tried to surgically force a Silicon Valley software identity onto a century-old industrial manufacturing body, and the corporate immune systems simply rejected the transplant. The cultures fought each other until the project bled out. They severely overextended their brand and their technical reach, falsely assuming that sheer capital and brute force investment could somehow conquer the incredibly intricate nuances of industrial AI. Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. When we look at legacy companies scrambling to survive and thrive in the modern digital age, we really have to ask ourselves, can digital transformation actually be bought with billions of dollars in a shiny new office in California? Or must it be organically, painstakingly built from within the existing culture? Well, the $7 billion ghost of Predix heavily suggests the latter. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep questioning how the future is really being